Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Betty Neal, and joining us, we have Frank Caracciolo, who will be leading today's webinar titled Exact Match, How to Identify the Right Combination of Experts for Every Case, which is part of Expert Institute's ongoing webinar series, In Our Expert Opinion. Frank is one of our regional directors here at Expert Institute, so I'll go ahead and turn things over to him to get started. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so keep your questions in mind, and then Frank will be sure to address them. But in the meantime, Frank, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you, Betty. And thanks again to everyone who's joining us today. First and foremost, of course, I hope you, your families, those around you, your loved ones, colleagues, are all staying safe and healthy during what's clearly an unprecedented time. Here at Expert Institute, we've been operating fully remote for about 6 weeks now, as I imagine many of you have been as well. But we are both a technology company and a consulting firm at heart. So we're doing our best to bring some of our knowledge about navigating the digital world to the larger legal community and share how we're using our technology to support our clients right now during this difficult time. As a regional director at Expert Institute, my focus is really to help injury and malpractice attorneys improve their legal advocacy with the best industry experts on their side. That's precisely what we're going to dig into today. In this presentation, I'll give you a glimpse into what the phrase exact match means for our team here at Expert Institute. I'm going to share how we go about strategically sourcing and screening experts who boost our clients' chances of securing successful outcomes on all of their cases, no matter how routine or niche they may be. Hopefully, some of the information we discuss can help you and your colleagues at least worry a little bit less about finding and consulting experts, both during these very unusual times as well as well into the future. So to kick off the discussion, I have what seems like a pretty simple question. What does it mean to find the right expert for your case? I'm certain for you, I don't need to educate any of you on what the federal rules of evidence deems an expert, but at the end of the day, the guidelines set forth by Rule 702 to qualify who can serve as an expert witness are relatively vague. You need someone who is skilled in their profession, has specialized knowledge, training, education, experience, etc. And because of these vague guidelines, expert qualifications and the fit for a certain matter, as you guys have probably seen, are frequently contested when the expert is presented in court. Which really begs the question, how can you be certain that you're selecting the right professional for this case, even if they appear to check all the boxes? What makes someone a good fit to speak to the facts, to liability, to causation, or to damages? How can you tell if an expert is qualified to provide you with an inspection, written report, whether they'll be articulate during a deposition or testimony, or that the judge or jury will receive them as qualified for the task? These are all the questions that so many attorneys come to us with. They have an injured client they know deserves compensation. They just need to make sure that their expert testimony is airtight so the client gets everything they deserve. My team's job is to minimize the risk an attorney has of having the opposition contest their expert suitability. The core of that process is answering all of those questions and, in short, really just determining the right fit. So to demonstrate our thinking caps in action and how we define the right fit here at Expert Institute, I wanted to start by discussing an interesting case we handled for one of our clients within the past year and how we were able to help them hone in on that right expert specialty. This was a tragic motor vehicle accident case that actually had nothing to do with the vehicle itself. The plaintiff had a propane tank that was filled at a local hardware store, and on the drive home, her propane tank exploded in the trunk of her car, causing her to suffer very severe burn injuries. Because this was an unusual MVA, the client came to us with an idea of who they might want to retain as an expert, but they wanted us to dig in a bit to see if there was something they might be missing. And so we got started. Also, perhaps there's a certain expert specialty that was more conducive to speaking to the unconventional circumstances of the explosion. When our research team first received the case, the question that centered their search was, what kind of expert is best suited for this case? Here's where I'll take some time to outline the process our team uses to figure out what the best specialty really is. In this case, we started by examining the parties we already knew were involved. Of course, you had the hardware store and also the store's employee who filled the plaintiff's propane tank. But the bigger question here was whether there were other parties who could be liable. And determining that first, would help direct our search for the right expert. When working with the attorney, we took a closer look at the events that led up to this matter and discovered that the plaintiff's propane tank was extremely old. At the time it was filled, the plaintiff's tank had no overflow detection device, which represents a great risk, especially for an older tank. The lack of an overflow detection device is actually so dangerous that state law requires such tanks be taken out of service immediately. All of this begs the question, why the employee even filled the tank to begin with? Clearly, this looks like the employee was negligent. But there are two important points to note that revealed additional liable parties and ultimately informed the experts we selected. One, even though the tank was old, it had active certification. So I'm just gonna give you a little background on propane tank aging and why recertification played an interesting role in this case. Propane tanks can usually last for 20+ years as long as they're properly maintained and recertified. But tanks more than 10 years old need to be recertified every 5 years to ensure that the unit remains safe, it's free of any defects. In this case, the plaintiff had the tank in question for 22 years, which is right around that sweet spot when you should look into retiring a tank. Propane and hardware experts say that the tank should probably be retired at 25 years, even if they're still passing those recertification tests. So even though the plaintiff's tank was pretty old, it had been recertified roughly 18 months prior to the incident. The second point of note was that our research revealed there was likely a gap in safety training. The employee who filled the tank claimed they didn't know the lack of overflow detection was even dangerous. But we discovered that the employee took a safety course through the propane supplier when they began working at the hardware store. So my team always uses liability, causation, and damages to guide our expert search. When we present a handful of expert candidates to an attorney, we let the attorney know exactly in what capacity we feel that particular expert can support their case. In this case, for causation, the hardware store shouldn't have filled this tank and should have disposed of it according to state safety laws. So we need an expert who can discuss hardware store policies. For liability, and this is a big one, the retailer should not have recertified such an old tank. But the propane supplier's safety course should have trained the employee to identify defective propane tanks, such as the one in question. And of course, we can't forget about damages. No matter how much of an expert someone is in the various elements of propane safety, that expert's never going to be able to assess the lifelong impact of the plaintiff's injuries incurred, so we need another expert to speak to that. My team sourced a range of unique experts for this particular client, including 3 different propane experts, each with specific specialties, training, and work experience. The distinction is always necessary to avoid any Daubert or Fry challenges down the road. Having one expert try to cover too many topics can lead to he or she being criticized for speaking outside the realm of their expertise. On the flip side, you don't want to retain too many experts within the same discipline to avoid cumulative or duplicative testimony, so there's always that balance. This attorney ultimately chose to retain 2 of the 3 propane experts we found, in addition to a hardware safety store expert and the damages expert, because each one had distinct training requirements that made them the right fit to discuss discrete elements of liability. Now, this is a relatively drawn out explanation of our thought process, but it really goes to show that many expert specialties can be the right fit for a case. Just depends on what you're looking to accomplish from consulting with that expert from the standpoint of liability, causation, and damages. But of course, as we just briefly touched on in this case, an expert specialty doesn't tell the whole story. I'm going to get into the 4 pillars of the right expert that my team uses when we search for and source the best experts. This is really the meat and potatoes of an expert search for our team. First, we start with the basics. Of course, your expert has to clear a background check to avoid disqualification, and they need the right specialty, subspecialty, education, work experience, etc., to speak to the facts or issues at hand in this case. Oftentimes, when attorneys reach out to their colleagues for referrals, they're basically limited to this category. Next are pragmatics. This is where we get into the more practical aspects. Expert fees are generally hefty. Sometimes a certain professional may be the perfect fit for your case, but if you can't afford to work with them, they're just not a perfect fit for you at that time. Same thing applies for logistic concerns. Many attorneys need an expert close enough to drive to their office or to a site for an inspection. Some who handle major MDLs or class actions will put the most nationally recognized expert on a plane. It comes down to resources at your disposal. If you have set travel expectations from the onset, This will help identify the best expert for you and your firm in this specific case. Litigation history is something that my team sees a range of preferences for. Some firms prefer to work exclusively with experts who have reviewed, say, 10 or more cases and been deposed several times, because they don't have the time or resources to coach an expert through their first rodeo. Maybe they feel like it's just not appropriate for that particular case. Others prefer to work with relatively green experts, sometimes all the time, because they want to avoid that potential hired gun bias should that expert have to make a court appearance. Again, this really comes down to your particular preference, both as a litigator and for your specific case. For attorneys who primarily rely on expert directories or their listservs that they have access to source their expert witnesses, this category is about as far as they can feasibly get in terms of screening for the expert that they need. Next is the nitty-gritty. In my opinion, this is really the heart of what makes an expert the right fit for a case. As we saw in the previous case study, technical training is a major factor in an expert's ability to speak to the liability and causation in a case. But beyond that, having the right certifications and licenses is crucial to avoid criticism from opposing counsel. In Florida, for example, out-of-state experts need a special certificate to even act as an expert. Having industry certs and licenses only helps to fortify your expert's testimony for your case. Same thing applies for research and publications. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to dig into an expert's publication history before you retain them. We've seen and heard horror stories about experts who were completely taken down during cross-examination because their opinion conflicted with research they co-published with a peer, 10, 20 years back. Of course, it's incredibly time-consuming to do all the research on your own when you have so many other cases on your desk. So for my team, this is really just another step in our specific search process. We really pride ourselves on being able to take those grueling tasks off your plate and provide you with that critical research up front. Depending on your state or jurisdiction, where and how long an expert is practiced are also important. For example, in Alabama, the expert's credentials need to match the defendant's credentials exactly. And the expert had to be certified in practicing in that specialty at the time of the alleged incident and the 2 years prior. Tennessee has a contiguous state rule that mandates the expert either have been working in a state touching Tennessee or in the state of Tennessee itself the year of and the year prior to the date of negligence. For attorneys who face strict state and jurisdiction requirements, they need to make sure they retain really great experts who also check 100% of these requirements. And that's not always an easy thing to do. Nailing these nitty-gritty elements of an expert's qualifications has the power to set your case up for success. I've had many clients whose cases settled before they even went to trial simply because of the quality of the experts they retained with our assistance. Having that airtight approach to sourcing experts only saves you a tremendous amount of time and money in the long run. Finally, we've got we call the intangibles, and this is probably the most underrated category, but in my opinion, it has the greatest impact on your experience working with the expert. And when I say intangibles, I'm referring to those X factors that you can't really discern from a CV, your own research, or even their litigation history, but that really have the power to drive your case home. And it starts with availability. Having an expert who's easy to work with, communicates effectively, who responds to emails, treats their legal consulting work with a great deal of pride and doesn't look at it just as a side project, as some can tend to do at times. Their disposition is another critical factor. You want to make sure you'll have a good working relationship with this professional for the duration of the case. I'm sure with this audience, you all know that some cases can take years and years to settle. So it's important to retain an expert who's pleasant to work with. Someone who can educate you on their discipline. You don't need someone who comes off condescending or arrogant. Not only will it be difficult for you to work with them, but someone who's arrogant won't come across very well to a jury should they eventually have to testify for you. And then speaking of testifying, you also want to make sure your expert has good oratory skills in case they do need to relay facts to a judge or jury. After all, their primary job is to assist the fact finder. And then last, and certainly not least, we have professional associations and conflicts of interest. These often go hand in hand in my experience. I'll bring up another case to illustrate this point in just a few minutes. But professional associations or conflicts can make or break your case. Usually if an expert is associated with a prestigious institution, they'll make that known through their CV and other documentation. But on the flip side, if there are institutions they don't wish to be in association with, or that they're conflicted with, that's often harder for you to determine. This aspect requires more research to ensure you're working with a professional who is 100% credible and on your side. Now, when you look at this screen, this is our perspective and how we categorize these expert sourcing priorities at Expert Institute. We've seen thousands of cases and sourced hundreds of thousands of expert witnesses for attorneys in all 50 states. And based on that experience, we really believe that this process is the most comprehensive way to approach the critical task of finding the right expert for each and every case you work on. Depending on your firm's needs, some of these priorities we've highlighted might shift or fall into different categories. Sometimes a referral from a colleague or an online directory can help you address some of these factors, but ultimately the only way to make sure that you're working with the right expert for your case is to use a comprehensive research and data-driven approach to sourcing and screening those candidates. That's really the beauty of the custom recruiting process at Expert Institute. It is so easily tailored to your specific needs for that specific case. As we go along here, I want to take a look at the 4 pillars I just outlined, which are really the foundation of our comprehensive process. And as I mentioned before, I had another case study to share that really illustrates these 4 pillars in action. This is a really niche hydroblasting case we handled a few years ago. Plaintiff was a diver. This diver was shot with 5,000 PSI of water while hydroblasting pier intake grates. As you can imagine, again, sustained very serious internal injuries. The client needed an expert to inspect the power washing equipment and determine if and or how a safety mechanism may have been modified. In this case, the client basically knew exactly what type of expert specialty they needed to opine on in this case. But they turned to us because finding the right person for this job became very complicated and an exhausting task for the attorney and their support staff. The technical expert requirements in this case made the pool of eligible professionals very limited. The client needed an expert who was a certified diver. That certified diver had to be familiar with power washer technology and in addition had to be able to speak to the difference between handling that equipment in water versus on land. Again, not many people are trained to handle these tools underwater. So the client came to us to try and match those specific training requirements. Now, there's also another layer of complication in this case. That's the dynamic of the industry. It's a very niche industry with less than 10 hydroblasting companies in the entire state of California. It also just so happened that one of the larger hydroblasting companies was actually the defendant, of course, in this matter. So because of the defendant's prominence in the industry, many experts were pretty weary of speaking out against them for fear of barring themselves from further employment opportunities, as one would come to expect. Makes sense. But going back to the 4 pillars of our expert search here, in this case, the basics and the pragmatics were almost irrelevant. Our team needed to focus on our specialty, which is sourcing and screening for those nitty-gritty and intangible qualities, namely technical training, certifications and licenses, the locations active, availability, and then of course those professional associations and potential conflicts. On our end at Expert Institute, there's 2 parts to executing a successful expert search. Part 1 is that data-driven sourcing process. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, we are a data and technology company at heart, and we pull data on experts across the country from thousands of sources. We also have an internal expert witness monitoring system to help us keep up to date on an expert's career, location changes, as well as their litigation history. We also have historical data on well over 50,000 cases at our research team's fingertips. Our proprietary expert matching algorithms aggregate all this information and present us with a pool of viable expert candidates. This is a quick, instantaneous way for us to essentially cover the basics and pragmatic categories in the process. The power of our data really lies in being able to determine a pool of great expert prospects in a fraction of the time traditional search methods take. But to then make sure we solve for those nitty-gritty and intangible requirements, we paired the data with our consultative screening approach. That consultative screening approach is part two, as you see on your screen, the holistic candidate evaluation. We have a robust team of researchers on staff who specialize in this holistic evaluation process. Their job is to dig into those tough to gauge qualities, excuse me, to find the right expert for your case. So their first step is evaluating the candidates that our data-driven sourcing method procures. That custom expert outreach process involves soliciting feedback on the case facts and asking those detail-oriented questions we need to ask to fully vet the credentials of the experts and their potential fit for your case. Then, as I mentioned before, associations and conflicts can present themselves in all kinds of ways. This hydroblasting case is a great example. Many of the expert candidates that my team spoke with had never worked with the defendant, but were unsure if their career might lead them to seek employment there down the line, and fear of jeopardizing that opportunity really hindered their interest and availability for the case. So to avoid wasting the attorney's time with any experts who could possibly feel conflicted, every single candidate was reviewed, that we reviewed, went through a rigorous internal vetting process before the attorney even got to take a peek at their CV. Ultimately, this hydroblasting case was highly successful for our client. After screening hundreds of experts, we connected them with the branch operations manager for a hydroblasting company. He had more than 35 years experience, held all the required certifications and licenses I laid out earlier, wasn't conflicted with the defendant, so he had no qualms about speaking out against them. Availability, he was available for inspections and review, and best of all, really easygoing, well-spoken, articulate, great working relationship that was developed with the attorney. Client was overwhelmed with the quality of this candidate and was able to settle the case early because of the credentials. Experience really led to a very strong expert report to help strengthen their position. As I mentioned before, our job here at Expert Institute is to help firms better advocate for their clients, and we do so by connecting them with top-notch expert witness support. And the bread and butter of our service is really our award-winning custom expert search service, which is really the process I just outlined for you. And like I said, what makes expert search service so unique is that intersection of a highly consultative approach to expert sourcing, data-driven recruiting, and go back a couple slides, that holistic candidate evaluation. Here at Expert Institute, we are relied upon by thousands of attorneys. We are working on anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 cases per month. And really our mission on each and every case is simple. It's to pair the litigator with the perfect expert or combination of experts while saving them a tremendous amount of time and money along the way. In this presentation, I've chose to highlight a few personal injury matters, but the same processes and procedures can be applied to medical malpractice cases, commercial litigation, intellectual property, criminal cases, etc. I mean, we frequently work on all of the cases I just mentioned, in addition to your standard PI cases that I've outlined a couple examples of. Hopefully you can take some of this information back to your cases, take a look at your docket, see if we can be of help. Perhaps there's cases on your colleagues' desk that we can assist with. Perhaps our team could be of assistance to your firm, and we can get a chance to connect you with experts on a case that perhaps is a bit niche, maybe not a phone call away, or could be a common expert, but an opportunity to save time would be welcome for you right now. Appreciate everyone's time at this time. Betty, I'm happy to take any questions that everyone may have about the cases I've shared, or a little bit about our process or service.
And thank you so much, Frank, for that insight. So we'll go ahead and open this up to questions. If anyone would like to ask something of Frank, feel free to type those out in the question section, and then I'll be sure to pass those along to Frank to answer. So Frank, I'll go ahead and kick things off here, and backing up a little bit, you had mentioned that data-driven sourcing was one of the major processes that Expert Institute utilizes. What sources are those exactly that Expert Institute is looking at?
Sure. So there's a lot of unique resources that we use, but to give you some insight, and perhaps the most important, really starts with the proprietary technology that we've developed. That technology as I mentioned, is monitoring experts, literally millions of experts and thousands of unique specialties. It's culling the web for their experience, for the accolades that they might be receiving. If it's medical experts, we're looking at maybe who's being published. We're looking at academics. We're looking at their achievements. For non-medical, it's tracking and capturing information about perhaps who's being recognized by the various trade associations that they might be involved in. So first and foremost is that proprietary technology that really this entire process is built on. But in addition to that, there's a lot of different gathering data websites and subscriptions that we have. Sometimes as common as things like LinkedIn, or again, trade association websites. And then, it might not be, too complex, but the reality, Betty, is sometimes we find ourselves like everyone else, on Google doing some diligence, but we've got well over 70 researchers on staff that have great experience on exactly where to look, beyond our existing technology and those subscriptions to make sure that we're finding that intricate data that can make a difference in identifying that perfect fit.
And going off of that, you gave some examples about finding the most niche experts out there. What might happen in the case where maybe the specialty is so niche that the perfect expert for the attorney just might not exist?
Sure. Well, and that's a great question, and one we certainly get from time to time. The reality is if something occurred, if there's a niche case that's out there, a very unique personal injury matter, you think, for example, like the hydroblasting case, not a common company that you're going to find in every executive park or strip mall. These niche cases are really where folks come to us to challenge us, and that's really where we've built our success. Early on in the Expert Institute's history, is our ability to uncover those niche experts. Now, sometimes combining the niche experts with the preferences and parameters of an expert search, that could pose some challenges. So we are always going to identify, hey, with an attorney, what's your preferences in litigation history, as I mentioned earlier, or geography, as well as several other specific questions into what they feel their ideal expert would look like, come from, et cetera. And it's open dialogue with the attorney to understand that if we're running into some issues, perhaps we might not be able to find the specific expert in a certain area. We're always going to start our search from the inside out. We'll have that dialogue, but if there's a need, there's a challenging case out there, we continuously step up to the plate to deliver and work with the attorney to make some tweaks sometimes to the search to ensure that we can find the right person. And there might just have to be a little bit of give in some of the preferences at times, but we don't stop until the attorney's satisfied with who they are engaging with and retaining.
And on the flip side of that, how might Expert Institute provide value for attorneys whose cases might be more typical or run-of-the-mill?
Yeah, no, that's great. And obviously, you'd suspect that's a fair point that attorneys ask frequently, is, hey, I can use a service like yours, but when I'm stuck, oftentimes that might be the motivator to work with us initially. But once attorneys get exposure to our service and the process in which we go through, as I just outlined here for the last little bit, they start to realize that even in their more common needs, right, your more common, let's just call them slip and falls or MVAs, where there might be some redundancy or repeat type experts that they're working with, there's A, value in the time that we can save them. B, we're providing fresh voices, fresh perspectives so that they don't run into the risk of overusing their existing stable or roster of experts. It's not necessarily in place of those individuals, but if you're doing that same kind of work on a consistent basis, working with us can give you some exposure to some different perspectives and experts. Also, if they're using, again, some other services, our service and the way we're designed often saves them a great deal of money in how other services might charge for those more common experts that they find themselves often retaining.
And going off of that, we have a question from an attendee regarding a medical malpractice case, for example. So you had mentioned that one of our services is that we will research an expert's background and see what their publication history is. Could you shed some light on maybe some Other things that Expert Institute might offer in terms of a medical malpractice case, going more into the specific topic at hand. For example, whether a particular medication or a specific amount might cause a specific adverse reaction. Is there a way that Expert Institute might be able to help with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the medical side, what makes us very unique is we actually have a team of 15 physicians in-house. And we work with hundreds of attorneys in that regard, where our doctors are helping these attorneys assess cases or answer specific questions related to medical records, injuries occurred on personal injury matters, so that they can avoid the retainers and billable hours, just to help identify if they have a case, or to just answer a couple very specific questions. They're not having to sort out to find that specialty. Our 15 doctors on staff go across numerous subspecialties. I won't list them all for the sake of time here, but general surgery, pediatrics, psychiatry, OBGYN, internal medicine. So we've got a long list of very qualified physicians that work with attorneys specifically in that regard, as essentially an extension of their office, to help assist in situations like you just outlined, in place of having to go through the process of sourcing an expert just to help even evaluate a case for merit, or ensure that the damages are what they think they can be. They can rely on our doctors in-house to do that. We don't have to go source an expert and wait for that process. We work with them hand in hand in that regard.
And what is Expert Institute's pricing structure for those services? And can you also explain why Expert Institute charges an upfront fee?
Sure. So a couple things to unpack there. One, in terms of our fee, our expert search fee is standard price is $2,500. That $2,500 is all the revenue that we'll generate on an expert search. So that takes you through, when you think back 10, 15 minutes ago, to those 4 pillars and that data-driven process, the holistic candidate evaluation, where we're screening them, doing the background checks, digging into their litigation history. All of that is part of that process. And we turn that around within, typically, depending on the specialty, most frequently 3 to 5 business days, where we are then presenting experts for the attorney to review, and then we'll coordinate conference calls for them to actually speak to the experts before they ever decide who they'd like to retain. So that $2,500 fee takes them through that exact process. If we need to expedite something, more quickly, then there could be some additional charge, because we simply need to assign more folks to getting that done. And that happens from time to time. You need something turned around in 24 to 48 hours. We frequently deal with that. So that's the price. Why we charge an upfront fee was the second part of your question. And in that, we're charging an upfront fee because the service that we provide is a very comprehensive search process, and that work is all done that fee is provided in place of any sort of markup on the expert's fees. Most third-party services, I'm sure many of you out there have experience with other services at certain points in time, and how they traditionally work is they'll source experts, but they've got a set network, and they middleman the accessibility and the billing. They're really driving their revenue off of the billable hours of the expert. We believe in being much more transparent, and so we're very clear with what our fee is up front. Does guarantee to find a qualified expert for the case, but we're not generating any fees off of the billable hours down the line. And so, especially on cases that are going to take a great deal of time, reports, maybe an inspection, if it's medical, perhaps an IME needs to be done. You're not on the clock with us from a financial perspective for those hours and hours that are accumulating of the expert's time. So our upfront fee is the only revenue that we generate. It eliminates any sort of bias in who we might source expert-wise, because their fees have no impact. And so that you're paying a true rate to the expert, no markups at all. And really, our value is not when that expert is on the stand, say 18 months from now. Our opinion is, again, transparency. We shouldn't be earning money at that point. our value that we brought is really in that comprehensive search to ensure that you found the right fit out of the gate. And you know, in terms of, I just wanted to also share that's important outside of just our expert search and that $2,500 on a case-by-case basis. We do offer something called our partnership program, and that is a very unique arrangement that does away with the per engagement cost and just proves to be a much more cost-effective way for plaintiff firms to work with us.
And just for the sake of clarity, do these experts that Expert Institute works with, do they pay a fee to be a part of our database?
Good question. No, there is no financial or contractual ties between us and the experts. It's like that by design for some of the reasons I just laid out and why our model is what it is from a pricing perspective, but also to ensure you know, less vulnerability, if at all, for the expert and their impact on that case. They have no financial or contractual relationship with us. So if they're asked that question under deposition or on the stand, you know, it's a very different answer they're going to get versus your traditional third-party services.
Great. Thanks so much, Frank, for the presentation, and for those joining, thank you so much. Bottom line, hope everyone is keeping safe and healthy during these times. If there's any way that we can help with your caseload, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, be on the lookout for more webinars from us as part of our ongoing series. Thank you so much again, Frank, and take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Betty.